At 1 o'clock, the servants' dinner was already moving through a large Victorian house. Hot meat and vegetables had reached the servants' hall. The upper and lower servants could sit at the same table for that first course, but they did not finish the meal as equals. When the meat was cleared, the upper servants moved to the housekeeper's room. A still room maid carried in pudding or tart, handed the plates around, and then returned to finish her own dinner. That short journey answers the first part of our question. Victorian servants cooked and carried the feast, but what they received depended on rank, room, household scale, and permission. Even food that had already appeared in the family dining room did not automatically become theirs. In some houses, entrees and sweets went to senior servants at supper. In others, the same dishes were kept for the family's luncheon the following day. The leftovers had an owner, and the owner was not assumed to be the person who had cooked them. If evidence-led history like this is what you come for, subscribe to Dynasty and Dust. Then tell me where in the world you are listening from, and what time it is there. The scene comes from a household guide published around 1880. It was not a diary of one maid, and it cannot tell us how faithfully every employer followed its advice. What it can do is something almost as revealing. It describes the order that respectable households were expected to recognize. It names the rooms. It gives the meal times. It says who poured the tea, who carved the meat, who laid each table, who carried dessert, and who went back to finish eating after serving everyone else. That creates two questions we will carry through this house. The first is simple. How could people working under the same roof, for the same family, and sometimes sitting at the same first course, end their dinner in different rooms with different food? The second reaches deeper. If a dish survived the family meal, what rule decided whether it crossed into the servants' hall, stopped in the housekeeper's room, or went back upstairs the next day? The still room maid is the human center of the opening, because her movement makes the hierarchy visible. The guide does not give her a name. We will not invent one. It gives her an action. She lays the table in the housekeeper's room. She brings the pudding when the senior servants are seated. She hands plates to them. Then she returns to her own dinner. Her path is documented even where her private thoughts are not. Imagine the physical sequence without adding a melodrama the record cannot support. One table has just served hot meat and vegetables. A second room waits for the final course. The maid crosses a threshold, carrying what the first table will not share. She serves people who are themselves servants, but whose rank places them above her. When she turns back, the meal allotted to her is still governed by time. Breakfast, tea, and supper were commonly given half an hour in this guide. Dinner was given an hour. A household bell could still ring. The familiar picture of life below stairs usually divides the mansion into two worlds. The family lives above. The servants work below. That picture is useful, but it is incomplete. Below stairs contained its own upstairs and downstairs. The housekeeper, butler, cook, valet, and lady's maid could count as upper servants. Housemaids, kitchen maids, scullery maids, footmen, boys, and other workers occupied different places in the service order. Their titles affected authority, pay, lodging, prospects, and, as the dinner scene shows, the course that arrived at the table. This does not mean every great house used the same arrangement. The guide repeatedly says that practice varied. Some ducal establishments kept a distinct steward's table. Many ordinary wealthy homes used the housekeeper's room for senior staff. Smaller homes had no servants' hall at all. But the variation does not weaken the story. It reveals the mechanism. A servant's food was not one fixed Victorian ration. It was a household decision, produced by scale, rank, economy, custom, and the judgment of people who controlled the stores. The feast in our title, therefore, has two meanings. It is the visible banquet prepared for the family and guests. It is also the larger pool of food moving through kitchens, pantries, dining rooms, service corridors, housekeepers' rooms, and servants' halls. The question is not merely whether servants were hungry. Hunger mattered, and harsh treatment existed. The sharper question is who possessed the authority to turn that pool into somebody's meal. Before we leave this dinner, notice the pudding dish. At first, it looks like a small privilege. By the end, it will show us the architecture of rank, the economics of board wages, the power of the larder key, and the limit of what an archive can honestly say about a worker's plate. For now, it crosses the doorway in the hands of someone who does not follow it to the second table. The first surprise is that hunger alone explains almost nothing about this system. A servant could receive substantial meals in one household and poor, irregular, or monotonous food in another. A senior servant and a junior servant could eat different courses under the same roof. A cook might be trusted to arrange the staff dinner, or a mistress might inspect and alter it. Dining room food might pass below, stop with the upper servants, or remain reserved for the family. One dramatic word cannot hold all of those conditions. This matters because the most clickable version of the story is also the easiest to overstate. A table, heavy with meat, beside a servant holding an empty bowl, creates an instant moral contrast. Some workers undoubtedly experienced real deprivation. Yet the period guide we opened does not describe a universal policy of starvation. It describes cold meat at breakfast, bread, toast, butter, tea or coffee, hot meat and vegetables at dinner, bread and cheese, and sometimes pudding, tart, eggs, bacon, beer, or supper dishes from the dining room. It also describes limits, differences, economical substitutions, and food that servants were forbidden to take. The evidence leads to a harder and more interesting conclusion. Calories alone do not reveal power. Permission does. A full plate could still be evidence of dependence if another person decided its contents, its hour, its room, and whether the worker could finish before being called away. A plain plate could represent very different conditions depending on whether it was a normal agreed meal, an economy imposed by the mistress, a hurried cold dinner chosen to save the cook more labor, or food purchased collectively with board wages. The source itself needs careful handling. The Servant's Practical Guide presents rules for households that wanted to appear orderly. Its anonymous author writes from the world of employers and senior domestic management. The book tells us what a disciplined establishment ought to do. It sometimes praises considerate masters and mistresses, which quietly admits that consideration was not guaranteed. It sometimes criticizes employers for poor arrangements. It sometimes speaks about servants in the controlling language of its class and time. That makes the guide neither a perfect mirror nor a useless fantasy. A rule book can reveal pressure precisely because it has to name the behavior it wants. When it says punctuality in the servants' hall should be as strict as punctuality in the dining room, it tells us irregular staff meals were a problem. When it says considerate employers tried not to ring during the allotted meal hours, it tells us interruption was possible enough to require advice. When it sets different allowances for men and women, it exposes a hierarchy that the author treats as ordinary. When it explains that dining room remains should not be eaten in some kitchens, it makes ownership explicit. We will use this book as a map of expected order, and then test it against named houses, surviving objects, institutional research, and the limits of those records. We will not turn every prescription into a universal fact. We will not treat one Christmas cake as a daily ration. We will not assign a documented menu to a servant unless the source actually connects them. Most of all, we will not borrow the invented names and quotations that circulate in popular videos merely because they make the plate feel personal. The still room maid at the opening shows another way to create a human story. We do not need to supply a private monologue. Her assigned action already contains conflict. She is a worker whose mealtime overlaps with her duty to serve another group of workers. She carries a valued course into a room associated with greater status. She returns to a different place. The documented route does the dramatic work. The same discipline applies to hunger. We can say that working-class poverty in Victorian Britain was severe, and that many servants did not work in country houses or receive full board. We can say household food varied greatly. We can say the guide's insistence on regularity and sufficient arrangements did not ensure compliance. What we cannot say is that every servant cooking a feast was starved by design. That would replace a complicated labor system with a single, unsupported verdict. The better model is a controlled food economy. The household bought, raised, stored, counted, cooked, served, reused, and sometimes converted food into cash allowances. Different officers controlled different stages. The mistress set policy or delegated it. The housekeeper kept accounts and watched stores. The cook turned provisions into meals and sometimes chose the staff dinner. The butler controlled wine and often carved. Junior workers carried, laid, cleared, washed, and waited. Once we see that economy, the dinner table stops being an afterthought to the grand house. It becomes one of the clearest places to watch authority operate. Who sits first? Who carves? Who pours? Who receives pudding? Who can take a dining room dish? Who must leave the remains untouched? Who controls the key? Who is allowed cash instead of beer? Each answer locates a worker inside the household order. So the episode will not ask whether Victorian servants had one true menu. They did not. It will ask what changed the menu and why. The next change is the size of the house itself. Before we reach a named kitchen, we need to walk through the rooms that turned one staff into several dining classes. A grand house divided labor before it divided food. The largest establishments carried a hierarchy detailed enough to sound like a small institution. A house steward might oversee broad operations. A groom of the chambers, butler, housekeeper, cook, valet, lady's maid, nurses, footmen, housemaids, kitchen maids, laundry maids, scullery maids, boys, grooms, and gardeners occupied defined places. Not every house employed all of them, but the model mattered. Food followed the same lines of command as work. Isabella Beaton's household manual describes the housekeeper rising early, checking that domestics were at their duties, overseeing marketing and orders, examining linen, and maintaining the household's working order. In a large establishment, she could breakfast in the housekeeper's room with the lady's maid, butler, and valet. A still room maid waited on them. In mansions of very high rank, Beaton says, 2 distinct tables could be kept. Principal household members ate in the steward's room. Other domestics ate in the servants' hall. The room was not simply a convenient place to put a table. It was a status statement. A person admitted to the steward's room did not become a family member. The separation from the family remained. But within the servant body, that room recognized seniority, authority, and proximity to elite life. The butler managed precious drink and presentation. The housekeeper managed female staff and stores. The valet and lady's maid entered intimate personal spaces. The cook controlled skilled production. Their meal location confirmed the rank their duties had already created. The guide from around 1880 gives the arrangement an almost ceremonial precision. In the steward's room or housekeeper's room, the housekeeper poured tea. Cups, saucers, milk, sugar, a teapot, and a coffee pot were arranged. Cold meat such as ham, meat pie, roast meat, or boiled pork could be served. Eggs and fried bacon might appear when available. The butler carved. In the servants' hall, breakfast was arranged on a similar principle. But similar did not mean identical. A head housemaid or kitchen maid poured tea or coffee. An under-butler or footman carved the cold meat. Bacon and eggs were said to be seldom given there. In the kitchen, the cook poured and carved. 3 meal spaces could operate at once, each with its own presiding worker and its own version of the household breakfast. The differences continued through the day. At 11, larger houses might give cold meat and beer for lunch, while smaller households might give bread, cheese, and beer. At 1, the servants' dinner arrived. In the common arrangement described by the guide, upper and under servants entered the same hall, with the upper servants entering first. Hot meat and vegetables were set out. The butler and housekeeper could carve when 2 joints were provided. A footman helped bread and beer as required. Then the meal divided again. The still room maid laid a table in the housekeeper's room. Upper servants moved there for pudding or tart and cheese. She handed the plates, returned to finish her own dinner, and came back when the bell called for the next course. The movement was not random. It transformed rank into a repeated bodily routine. Enter first, sit in the recognized place, move to the separate room, receive the sweet course, call the junior worker back. There is a temptation to describe every lower servant watching this procession with resentment. The sources we are using do not give us that shared emotion, so we will not assign it. The hierarchy remains consequential without an invented reaction. The still room maid loses uninterrupted time. Junior staff receive a different course pattern. Senior staff gain a place of their own. Everyone learns the structure by performing it. Household scale could intensify or compress the pattern. The very wealthiest families might support a steward's room with its own boy and service routine. More ordinary large households use the housekeeper's room. A household of only 3 women servants might have neither a servant's hall nor a housekeeper's room. They ate in the kitchen. This is why a general statement about what servants ate can mislead even when each ingredient is accurate. The same bread, meat, or tea took on a different meaning depending on the room and the person authorized to distribute it. Architecture strengthened the arrangement. Service corridors and back stairs helped labor move without interrupting family display. Pantries, larders, still rooms, kitchens, servants' halls, and senior servants' rooms separated tasks and controlled access. The family dining room displayed abundance. The service rooms absorbed the planning, heat, noise, cleaning, storage, and timing required to produce it. The distance between those rooms was social as well as physical. Yet the most revealing threshold was not always the one between family and servant. It could be the doorway between the servants' hall and the housekeeper's room. The same staff crossed or did not cross it according to rank. The same pudding changed destination according to that boundary. Below stairs had a second dining room because below stairs had a second class line. Now the leftovers question sharpens. If senior servants occupied a different room and received different courses, did food from the family dining room reach them first? The guide's supper rules provide an answer, but the answer changes from house to house. That variation will lead us from room hierarchy to ownership. One room separated edible abundance from recognized entitlement. At supper in a large establishment, hot food might be allowed in the steward's room or housekeeper's room. Entrees and sweets, already served in the family dining room, could be sent there. That sounds like the familiar story of servants eating leftovers, but the route was neither universal nor equal. The dishes went to senior staff in a senior room. Other mistresses made a different choice. They allowed only the joints to be eaten below, and required the entrees and sweets to be saved for their own luncheon the next day. The food had left the family table, but it had not left family ownership. It could pass through the service system, be handled by servants, be stored by servants, and be reheated by servants, without becoming a servant meal. The servants' hall supper described in the same guide was plainer. It might consist of cold meat, hot vegetables, bread, and cheese. In the kitchen of a small establishment, the cook laid the table and carved. Some economical families gave only bread and cheese. The guide then states the rule that sits at the center of our title. What remained from the dining room dinner was not to be eaten in the kitchen. It was to be kept for the family's breakfast and luncheon. That is not evidence that every household locked every leftover away. The guide itself presents alternatives. It is evidence that leftovers were governed property. A servant did not acquire a claim by cooking the dish, carrying it, scraping it from a serving plate, or standing beside it in the pantry. Access depended on the rule adopted by the household and the authority delegated to the housekeeper or cook. This changes how we should picture thrift. Saving food was not merely a contest between waste and hunger. A joint, entree, sweet, crust, dripping, or cold dish could move through several planned uses. The family might eat it again. Senior servants might receive it. It might join a staff meal. The cook might transform it. Or a strict economy might reserve it, while staff received cheaper food. The decisive question was not whether the food existed. It was whose future meal the household had assigned to it. The rule also explains why secret eating and theft appear so often in later stories about service, even when a specific anecdote cannot be verified. A system that counts food and restricts access creates the category of unauthorized consumption. We do not need to repeat an unsourced tale of a maid dismissed for one bite to understand the pressure. The manuals already show that permission mattered, quantities were regulated, stores were watched, and remains could be reserved. The guide is unexpectedly clear that employers differed. Some left the servants' dinner entirely to the cook, and did not even ask what would be served. Others, especially in smaller or more economical homes, ordered the servants' dinner when they ordered their own. A cook could submit the proposed dinner on a slate, according to the contents of the larder. The mistress could approve it, alter it, or make suggestions. That slate is as important as the plate. It turns food into a documented decision. On one side sits the cook's knowledge of provisions, workload, and preparation. On the other sits the mistress's authority over expenditure and entitlement. A hot dinner might be preferred, but a cook in a small household could serve a cold dinner to save labor when family cooking left little time. The manual criticizes that outcome gently and encourages considerate mistresses to arrange something better. Again, an ideal rule exposes a practical strain. The difference between great and small houses will become a major turn in our story. In a great establishment, rank produces more rooms and more specialized service. In a small home, the mistress's oversight can move closer to the kitchen table. There may be fewer privileges, but there can also be fewer layers between decision and worker. Later, board wages will move part of that decision away from the mistress and into the hands of servants, pooling their own allowance. Before that turn, we need a named kitchen. Household manuals give us roles without faces. Popular videos often solve that problem by inventing a maid, a diary entry, or a quotation. We will use a different route. At Audley End house in Essex, a Victorian cook left a real notebook. Her name was Avis Crocombe. Crocombe worked in a kitchen built to serve a grand country house. English Heritage has used her surviving recipe collection and the physical rooms at Audley End to reconstruct Victorian cookery for a modern audience. The notebook gives us a human anchor, a skilled hand, and an object that crossed time. It does not, by itself, tell us what every kitchen maid ate. That limit is the reason to follow it. The recipe book records dishes and craft. Household supply books record purchases and provisions. Staff research restores names and roles. When those records are placed beside the rule book, they show how a food system could work without pretending that every surviving ingredient reached a particular plate. The pudding dish from our opening has shown us entitlement. Crocombe's notebook will show us production. Between them lies the central problem of historical evidence. A house can preserve the recipe for abundance more easily than the dinner of the person who helped create it. Avis Crocombe entered Audley End through a kitchen door and became visible to history through a notebook. English Heritage identifies her as a cook at the Essex country house during the later 19th century. The recipes she wrote down survive. The rooms in which she worked survive. Together, they give the food below stairs story a named worker and a physical place. Modern audiences may recognize Crocombe from English Heritage films, in which an interpreter prepares Victorian dishes in the Audley End kitchen. Those films are a popular treatment, not a primary witness. They help viewers understand equipment, sequence, and skill. The historical foundation lies beneath the performance in the surviving notebook, household records, staff research, and preserved service spaces. That distinction matters because Crocombe is easy to turn into an all-knowing guide. She can show us the work of a country house cook. She cannot personally answer every question about every servant meal. Her notebook is strongest when we let it remain what it is. It is a record of culinary knowledge selected and written by a skilled woman whose labor operated inside a larger household system. The cook held an unusual position. She was a servant, but in a large house she could count among the upper servants. The kitchen depended on her judgment. She organized preparation, understood timing, used stores, managed junior kitchen workers, and turned raw provisions into the dishes that made elite hospitality possible. A failed dinner could embarrass the family. A successful one could make the labor disappear behind effortless display. That authority did not make the kitchen a free domain. Menus answered to family expectations, guests, season, cost, and household policy. Stores could answer to the housekeeper. The family meal set the demanding clock. Junior workers took the dirtiest and most repetitive tasks. When a large dinner was sent up, washing, clearing, and preparation for later meals continued. At Audley End, the surviving staff research gives us people around the cook without requiring an invented household. Mary Ann Bulmer appears as the first kitchen maid in 1881. She was 25. A first kitchen maid stood close enough to skilled production to learn, assist, and carry serious responsibility, but she remained beneath the cook. Her place helps us see the kitchen as a chain of labor rather than one picturesque woman beside a range. The recipe notebook sits at the top of that chain because a cook's knowledge was worth recording. The scouring, carrying, trimming, washing, clearing, and waiting, performed by junior staff, were less likely to leave a document in their own hand. That imbalance shapes what a historian can narrate. Skill may survive as a recipe. Exhaustion may survive only through a duty list. A particular dinner may survive as a menu. The junior worker's share may vanish. Crocombe therefore deepens the opening scene in two directions. First, she restores agency. Food did not move through a mansion by magic. A cook made decisions, directed hands, and solved practical problems under pressure. Second, her survival exposes archival rank. The person with recognized skill and a notebook is easier to recover than the person who scrubbed the pans or carried the dish. The kitchen door is our recognition bridge. On one side is the familiar Victorian feast. On the other is the operating system that produced it. But we will keep walking past the cook, because the leftovers question belongs to the whole staff. A recipe can tell us how a dish was made. It cannot tell us who was permitted to eat what remained. To reach that answer, we need to compare the notebook with the rules that governed meals and the records that list provisions. We also need to look at the workers beside Crocombe. The next name belongs to a younger woman, whose position placed her closer to the heavy preparation that elegant service concealed. Her notebook survives, but no servant's plate survives with it. That sentence is not a complaint about the archive. It is a rule for using the archive honestly. A recipe proves that a cook recorded a method. A supply account proves that a household acquired a provision. A menu proves that a dish was planned or served in a named context. None of those objects automatically proves what one junior servant swallowed at the end of a working day. The difference between production and consumption sounds technical until a dramatic claim depends on it. If a supply book lists beef, mutton, veal, turkey, rabbit, and game, we may say those foods entered the household economy. If a recipe book contains an elaborate cake, we may describe the ingredients and the occasion when a strong source identifies it. We cannot distribute those foods among workers by imagination. This is where many stories cross a line. The grand menu is placed beside a servant image. The narrator decides the servant received only crusts. A specific deprivation becomes emotionally convincing because the contrast looks plausible, yet plausibility is not a source. The responsible alternative is not to remove emotion. It is to locate emotion in what is documented. The documented pressure is already strong. Crocombe and her kitchen team worked in a system where the family meal determined prestige. Junior staff prepared ingredients, maintained equipment, and cleared the results. At the same time, separate staff meals had to appear. A kitchen could be producing several dining experiences for different ranks on different clocks. The workers making those experiences were not equal inside the kitchen or at table. The cook's own position captures that contradiction. Crocombe belonged below stairs in relation to the family, yet she could belong with upper servants in relation to the kitchen maid. Her recognized expertise could bring better wages, greater authority, and a different meal room. The same food system that subordinated her to employers could elevate her above another worker. This is why rank matters more than a simple rich and poor split. The family dining room represents the highest claim. Senior servants hold a secondary claim. Junior servants hold another. The small household maid may face a different arrangement entirely. The food moves downward, sideways, back into storage, or into the next family meal, according to those claims. A recipe also carries a kind of voice. Crocombe chose to preserve culinary knowledge in writing. We should not force that voice to say what it does not. We can hear professional competence in the existence and organization of the notebook. We can connect its recipes to the kitchen where she worked. We can follow institutional research about her life. We should not invent a confession about hunger or benevolence. The restraint produces a better human story. Crocombe is not merely a victim standing beside somebody else's feast. She is a skilled worker whose knowledge helped create the feast. Her authority has limits, but it is real. Her notebook is not proof that all kitchen staff ate well. It is proof that a servant could possess expertise central to the household's public identity. Now place the notebook beside the pudding dish. The dish shows a course-changing destination with rank. The notebook shows the knowledge required to create that course. Between them stands a line of workers whose names survive unevenly. Our next task is to follow that line without turning it into a roster. One younger kitchen maid at Audley End was Sylvia Wise. Her documented role places her under the first kitchen maid and cook. We do not need a quotation from her to understand the pressure of sequence. The family dinner, servants' dinner, cleaning, and preparation could overlap. Her place in that sequence will show why mealtime itself could be a privilege. The kitchen hierarchy turned every meal into several separate clocks. Family breakfast, luncheon, dinner, tea, and supper demanded preparation and service. Servants had their own breakfast, lunch, dinner, tea, and supper patterns. Guests, balls, or seasonal celebrations added more. The kitchen did not finish one meal and then begin the next in a clean line. Tasks overlapped. Sylvia Wise appears in the Audley End staff record as a second kitchen maid in 1881. She was 20. Her position helps us move from the cook's knowledge to the junior labor that knowledge directed. A second kitchen maid assisted the worker above her and took on preparation, cleaning, and carrying within the kitchen department. Annie Chase, 17, appears as a scullery maid. The title identifies work at the hardest end of the kitchen chain. Pots, pans, water, ash, grease, and washing belong to a role whose success was measured by readiness rather than display. The family saw the polished result. The scullery absorbed what had to be removed. These names are not introduced to create a sad procession. Each changes the question. Crocombe shows recognized craft. Mary Ann Bulmer shows the experienced assistant position. Sylvia shows a younger worker learning and carrying responsibility. Annie shows the labor required after a dish had done its public work. The movement of food through the house also moved dirt, heat, weight, and time back toward the kitchen. Now consider the servants' dinner at 1 o'clock. For a footman or housemaid, the dinner bell might mark a pause. For kitchen staff, it could mark a deadline they had helped create. The guide says the servants' hall dinner was prepared within the kitchen department. Someone had to finish the vegetables, carve or send the meat, lay or supply the table, and then deal with dishes. A worker could be responsible for producing the very pause she hoped to take. This makes the rule against ringing during meals more consequential. The guide praises employers who avoided summoning staff during breakfast, dinner, and supper. Its advice recognizes that a meal was not protected by nature. It was protected, when it was protected, by household discipline. Without that consideration, service could reach into the hour set aside for food. The period manuals often describe tasks with confidence and neat sequence. A real kitchen had delay, breakage, changing guest demands, late arrivals, weather, fuel, and imperfect supplies. We should not invent a particular crisis at Audley End. We can say the job required coordination because the documented roles and meal schedules demand it. We can say rank affected who coordinated and who carried. English heritage research follows these workers beyond one census moment. Their later lives did not move as one servant story. Mary Ann married. Sylvia died young. Annie went on to work as a cook for many years and left a meaningful estate. Those outcomes resist the idea that junior kitchen work had one inevitable ending. Service could be temporary, a career ladder, a source of skill, a constraint, or several of those at once. Annie's later work as a cook is especially important. The scullery position was low, but it was not without a possible path. Knowledge could move down through instruction and up through experience. A worker washing the consequences of one dinner might later direct a kitchen herself. That is agency inside structure, not freedom from structure. The food hierarchy therefore shaped prospects as well as plates. A cook's room, wages, authority, and meal status could distinguish the top of the kitchen from the bottom. Learning the work might change a young woman's future. The same system that demanded obedience could also produce portable skill. Yet we still cannot say what Sylvia or Annie ate on a particular day. The record gives roles, ages, and some later outcomes. The meal manual gives patterns. The supply books give provisions. The responsible story holds those sources beside one another without pretending they fuse into a private diary. The next piece of evidence tests how far that restraint can still carry us. Audley End's records contain a remarkable cake and a list of meats. They offer a glimpse of abundance intended for servants, but they also state the limit we must not cross. The cook's discretion could soften rules without erasing them. A manual might give the mistress final authority, yet it also recognized households where the cook arranged the servants' dinner without close inquiry. Skill and trust could create room for judgment. The cook knew the larder, the workload, and what could be turned into a satisfying meal. That discretion mattered most, because the underlying ownership remained elsewhere. Audley End offers a vivid example of food prepared for servant life. English Heritage notes a recipe in Avis Crocombe's book for a Christmas cake containing 50 eggs. The institution interprets it as almost certainly intended for the servants' ball. The scale suggests a collective occasion, rather than one family's ordinary cake. It is a strong clue, carefully phrased. Notice what the source does and does not say. It connects a large recipe to a servant's event with high confidence. It does not turn that cake into an everyday ration. It does not prove that every worker received the same portion. It does not erase the ranked meal system on ordinary days. A celebration can reveal recognition while remaining exceptional. Household supply books add another layer. They show mutton, beef, veal, turkey, rabbit, and abundant game moving through the estate. That list dismantles the idea that the kitchen handled only one narrow set of ingredients. But English Heritage explicitly warns that we do not know exactly what the Audley servants consumed. That sentence is one of the strongest pieces of evidence in the episode because it tells us where institutional research stops. The supplies prove capacity, the rooms prove structure, the staff record proves presence, the notebook proves skill. Exact consumption remains partly unknown. The unknown does not leave us empty-handed. We know from period rules that large households commonly planned hot servants' dinners. We know senior and junior servants could receive different courses or rooms. We know some dining room dishes went to senior servants at supper. We know other households reserved them for the family. We know Audley End possessed the scale, staff, and provisions of a major house. The safest conclusion is a system of abundance, distributed through hierarchy, not an invented menu for each name. This changes the emotional center. The wrong question is whether Crocombe was secretly generous or whether one mistress was secretly cruel, when the sources do not say. The stronger question is how much choice a worker could exercise inside delegated authority. A cook trusted with staff meals could improve variety or timing. A cook facing a strict dinner slate had less room. A junior worker still depended on the choices made above her. Discretion could therefore soften a system without changing its ownership. The cook might use cheaper cuts well. She might plan a hot meal where a cold one would save labor. She might distribute a special cake for a servant's celebration. Those acts would matter. Yet the mistress could still set the budget, approve the dinner, or reserve the dining room remains. The named kitchen has now given us 3 advantages over a sensational story. It gives us real workers instead of invented witnesses. It gives us craft and action instead of passive suffering alone. It gives us an honest boundary instead of a false, exact plate. The next move is to shrink the house. Remove the steward's room. Remove the housekeeper's room. Remove the servants' hall. Leave a cook and 2 other women working close to the family in a smaller home. The ingredients may look familiar, but the control system changes. In that compressed household, servants eat in the kitchen. The mistress can reach the meal decision directly. The cook has fewer hands and more combined duties. There is less distance between family dining and servant dining, but not necessarily more equality. Scale will reveal why the grand mansion was only one part of Victorian service. Now shrink the mansion until 3 women run the domestic life of a respectable home. There is no house steward directing a complex institution. There may be no butler, no still-room maid, no kitchen maid, and no scullery maid. A cook, a housemaid, and a lady's maid might carry work that a great establishment divided among many people. The architecture shrinks with the staff. The period guide says that a small household of 3 women servants generally had no housekeeper's room or servants' hall. They ate in the kitchen. That single change removes a layer of ceremony, but it also removes distance. The worker's dining space is the workspace. The person preparing the family meal may sit in the same room where the range, utensils, stores, and unfinished tasks remain visible. It is easy to imagine the small home as gentler because there are fewer ranks. Sometimes relationships may have been more direct or familiar, but fewer workers also meant less specialization and less slack. One delay could fall on the same person expected to light fires, prepare food, clean, answer calls, carry water, and clear dishes. A meal hour on paper could collide with a longer list of combined duties. The cook's position changes first. In a great house, she may command a department. In the smaller home, she may do much of the preparation herself. The manual notes that a cook facing extensive work for the family might give servants a cold dinner to save trouble. The sentence is revealing because the cook is both manager and worker. Saving herself labor may reduce the quality or warmth of the meal she also has to eat. That is not a moral failure built into the role. It is a pressure created by insufficient hands. A hot servant's dinner requires fuel, preparation, timing, pots, serving, and washing. When family cooking has priority, the easiest place to reduce work may be the meal of the people doing it. The cook's discretion can help her colleagues, but it can also be constrained by exhaustion. The mistress stands closer to this decision. The guide says some ladies ordered the servants' dinner at the same time as their own. A proposed menu could be written on a slate, according to the contents of the larder. The mistress reviewed it and could make changes. In a compressed household, the distance between the family dining room and the kitchen table may be short enough to cross in moments. The kitchen table, therefore, carries several meanings at once. It is the place where servants eat. It is a surface for preparation. It may hold the slate that makes their dinner subject to approval. It may be the place where pooled board wages are later turned into a collective menu. The room contains both dependence and a possible route toward limited control. Household scale also changes the leftovers rule. In a large establishment, dining room dishes might be directed to the housekeeper's room, while the servants' hall received a separate supper. In the smaller household described by the guide, cold meat, bread, and cheese could be provided in the kitchen. In very economical families, only bread and cheese appeared. Dining room remains could still be reserved for the family's next meals. This creates a sharper physical contradiction than the grand house. The food does not need to travel down a long corridor to remain unavailable. It may pass through the kitchen where the servants sit. They may clean the dish and store the food while knowing it is assigned to breakfast upstairs. Proximity does not create entitlement. The small household engine changes our governing answer. Rank still matters, but scale now determines how rank is enforced. The great house uses rooms, officers, and tables. The small home uses direct oversight, combined duties, and the mistress's ability to approve a dinner slate. The worker may see more of the decision while possessing no greater final authority. Yet the story does not end with dependence. The same manual introduces an arrangement that moves purchasing power toward the servants themselves. It calls the arrangement board wages. To understand why that is a midpoint reversal, we first need to see how directly the mistress could reach the ordinary plate. In the smaller house, the mistress could reach every plate through approval, economy, and the simple fact that fewer people stood between her and the kitchen. The manual treats this supervision as normal. A prudent lady might examine the contents of the larder, order the family dinner, consider the servants' dinner, and alter the cook's proposal. The dinner slate turns that reach into an object. The cook writes what she believes can be served. The slate moves to the mistress. The mistress accepts or changes it. Then the decision returns to the kitchen as work. Nothing in that sequence requires the mistress to enter the servant's meal room while the meal is being eaten. Authority has already traveled through the slate. The choice between a hot and cold dinner shows the competing pressures. The guide says servants generally disliked a cold dinner and calls a hot dinner preferable when it could be arranged. In large households, a hot dinner was treated as a matter of course. In small households, family cooking could make it harder. A considerate mistress was encouraged to plan with the cook instead of leaving staff food to whatever labor remained. That word considerate carries evidence. It identifies a standard of behavior while admitting variation. The book does not guarantee that every mistress met it. It gives us the period argument that staff meals deserved planning, punctuality, and enough separation from family demands to be eaten. When that planning failed, the burden fell on workers whose own labor had priority elsewhere. The same pattern appears in pudding. Some households gave pudding to servants every day. Some gave it once or twice a week. Others paired economical puddings with particular kinds of meat. The guide debates these choices in the language of household cost and preference. Dessert below stairs was not merely a treat. It was an item in a management decision. This returns us to the still room maid. In the great house, she carried pudding to upper servants, and then went back to her dinner. In the small house, there may be no still room maid and no second room. The cook might make the pudding, serve or arrange it, eat at the kitchen table, and clean the utensils. The hierarchy compresses, but the labor does not disappear. Direct oversight could sometimes protect a meal if the mistress accepted responsibility. The manual urges her to arrange the servant's dinner instead of letting family demands crowd it out. It also could restrict the cook's judgment. The same slate that guarantees a planned hot meal can impose a cheaper one. The object has no moral character of its own. Its meaning depends on who writes, who approves, and whose needs count. This is why food is such a precise measure of domestic power. Wages are paid at intervals and may be negotiated at hiring. A meal decision occurs every day. It reaches the body quickly. It also reveals whether the employer sees food as a cost to minimize, a condition of labor, a mark of rank, or some mixture of all three. The cook is not passive in this exchange. She knows what is in the larder and what the kitchen can accomplish. She can recommend a meal. Where the mistress trusts her, she may decide it. Where time is short, she may choose the cold dinner. Her agency is real, but bounded by resources, authority, and workload. The other servants are affected by a negotiation. They may not enter directly. Their dinner appears after the cook and mistress have made decisions. A housemaid's hunger, preference, or workload may not reach the slate. The cook becomes an intermediary between employer policy and the staff table. That arrangement prepares the midpoint turn. Until now, food has looked like something the household provides and controls. Board wages change the form. Instead of receiving meals from household stores, servants receive money intended for food. They pool it. The cook caters for them. The employer gives up part of the daily menu decision, and the servants gain a limited independence the guide itself recognizes. The independence is not complete. The money has a set amount. Meal times remain tied to service. The kitchen and fuel still belong to the employer. Yet one central question changes. The servants are no longer asking only what the mistress will allow from her larder. They are deciding how to spend a food allowance together. Then the manual introduces money, where food seemed private and domestic. Some employers placed servants on board wages, even while the family was at home. Men and women received weekly sums intended to replace household meals. The servants pooled the money, and the cook purchased or arranged food for the group. Board wages reveal that food was part of compensation, not merely kindness. A servant's annual cash wage did not describe the whole bargain. Lodging, meals, clothing provisions in some roles, beer, tea, sugar, washing, and other allowances could affect the value and daily reality of employment. Change one of those elements and the worker's position changed, even if the stated yearly wage did not. The guide gives different board wage ranges according to gender and rank. Senior and junior women did not necessarily receive the same amount. Men could receive more. We do not need to convert those sums into a modern price to see the structure. The employer translated expected food into cash and still ranked the translation. The workers then faced a practical decision. Pooling could make the money go further. The cook already had the knowledge to plan quantities, buy provisions, and turn cheaper ingredients into meals. Her professional skill now served the staff purse directly. The group could decide where to economize and where to spend. The author of the guide remarks that board wages made servants independent in a way. That phrase is striking because it comes from a manual devoted to orderly hierarchy. Independence appears not as a political declaration, but as control over purchasing. The staff no longer depends on the mistress choosing each dinner from household stores. The arrangement also had limits and critics. The guide says it was not especially popular with either side. Employers might calculate savings differently according to the food their own family consumed. Servants might find the allowance tight, the catering work burdensome, or the arrangement less secure than full provision. Independence could arrive with risk. For the cook, board wages added another duty. She catered for her colleagues as well as managing family food. Pooling money required trust. A bad purchase affected everyone. A successful meal depended on her judgment. The same skill that gave a cook authority inside the employer's system now gave her influence inside a small servant collective. This is the midpoint reversal because it changes the owner of the immediate decision. Earlier, the dinner slate moved from cook to mistress and back. Under board wages, pooled money moves from servants to cook and then into the market. The employer still owns the kitchen and controls the hours, but the menu is no longer simply an issue from the employer's larder. The leftovers question changes with it. When servants provide their own food through board wages, dining room remains are even more clearly separate property, unless the household grants them. A dish left upstairs does not become part of the pooled staff purchase. The boundary between family stores and servant food becomes financial as well as spatial. Allowances create similar translations on a smaller scale. Tea and sugar might be issued in fixed quantities, or their use might be regulated by a housekeeper or cook. Beer might be provided, replaced with beer money, or declined by the worker. Washing might be found by the employer or compensated in cash. The employment bargain was assembled from pieces. Those pieces affected autonomy differently. A measured issue gives the worker a quantity, but not necessarily a choice of product. Cash gives choice, but exposes the worker to price and sufficiency. Shared provision can spread risk, but preserve employer control. Board wages can shift control, but add labor and budgeting pressure. This is far from the image of a servant waiting for scraps. It is not necessarily kinder. It is more accurate. The worker stands inside a compensation system where food can be provision, privilege, allowance, cash equivalent, forbidden remainder, or collective purchase. Each form answers our question differently. The next step is to follow waste through that system. What looks like an uneaten dish can remain an asset. Once the household treats it as future value, controlling the leftover becomes part of controlling the budget. What looks like waste becomes power inside this household, because a remainder still has a planned future. Cold meat can become another family meal. An entree can be saved for luncheon. Bread can be served again. Fat, bones, stock, and trimmings can be transformed through kitchen skill. The person who assigns that future controls value. The popular leftovers question often assumes two choices. Either food was thrown away, proving waste, or servants ate it, proving thrift. The period rules reveal more routes. Senior servants might receive certain dining room dishes. Junior servants might receive a separate supper. The family might reserve the remains. The cook might transform allowed provisions. Staff on board wages might buy their own food, while family leftovers stayed outside the pool. This is why the word scraps can hide more than it reveals. It combines edible dishes, kitchen trimmings, plate waste, bones, stale bread, damaged food, and deliberate leftovers into one emotional category. Those materials had different uses and different rules. A sweet removed intact from the family table was not equivalent to what had been scraped from a plate. The household's concern with waste also strengthened surveillance. A housekeeper was expected to know what came in and what was used. Beaton advised attention to average consumption and signs of carelessness. That responsibility could protect the household from loss. It also placed everyday eating within an accounting gaze. For workers, the consequence was immediate. Taking a remaining dish without permission could be defined as theft, even when the food seemed destined to spoil. Saving it for the family could be defined as good management, even when servants nearby received bread and cheese. The moral meaning followed ownership rather than appetite. We should be careful not to invent scenes of punishment. The documented rule is enough to establish the boundary. Food remained assigned. Stores were controlled. Quantities were watched. The system made unauthorized eating possible as a category because it made authorized eating specific. Board wages exposed the contrast. When workers pooled cash and asked the cook to cater, their food became their managed resource. Economy still mattered, but the saving could benefit the pool. A cheaper dish might leave money for another day. The same act of thrift has a different human meaning when the people eating share the decision. This does not turn board wages into liberation. The amount might be insufficient. Prices could rise. The cook could carry unpaid planning labor. The servants still worked within the employer's schedule and kitchen. Yet the arrangement demonstrates that dependence was not an unchangeable quality of food itself. It was produced by who controlled the provision. The midpoint has therefore moved us from menu to contract. The great house taught us that rank changes rooms and courses. Audley End taught us that production records do not equal individual diets. The small home taught us that family demands can crowd the staff meal. Board wages now show that shifting purchasing power can change the worker's relationship to the plate. That new model lets us return to the larder with better questions. A locked door is not only a symbol of mistrust, it is part of a chain of responsibility. The mistress delegates to the housekeeper. The housekeeper accounts for stores. The cook requests and uses provisions. Junior staff handle food without gaining an unrestricted claim. The key can protect supplies from waste and theft. It can also make one servant powerful over another. A housekeeper remains subordinate to the employer while holding authority over staff access. Like the cook, she occupies a middle position. She is controlled and controlling. In the next act, we will follow her key, the tea and sugar issues, the differentiated beer allowances, and the bell that could interrupt a meal. These objects show how the household translated broad class hierarchy into repeated daily decisions. The locked larder is where the leftovers question becomes an argument about delegated power. The locked larder makes the household's real argument visible. Food is necessary for everyone in the house, but necessity does not determine access. The key does. Whoever holds it stands between provision and use, between the mistress's property and the cook's need, and between a stored remainder and the person who might eat it. In a large establishment, the housekeeper commonly held that middle position. Beaton describes her overseeing marketing when no steward or man cook performed it. She ordered goods, examined household work, watched that departments ran properly, and prepared for the next day's demands. She was expected to account for what the house consumed. That accounting made her more than a senior maid. She managed information. She knew what entered the stores, what left, what remained, and what the normal rate of use should be. A change could signal guests, waste, poor planning, carelessness, or unauthorized taking. The ledger extended her authority beyond the moment she unlocked a door. The housekeeper's power was delegated. She did not own the food. She answered upward to the mistress or household head. Yet delegation gave her real authority over other servants. A cook might request provisions. A still-room maid might receive tea or sugar. A junior worker might handle a dish. The housekeeper could decide whether the request matched the rule in the account. This is another internal hierarchy beneath the family. The housekeeper is subordinate and powerful at once. Her own status may bring a private room, a better table, and greater wages. Her responsibilities also make her the person expected to enforce economy. She can be judged for waste that another worker causes, which gives her reason to watch closely. The larder key, therefore, should not be reduced to a Gothic symbol. It belongs to a practical system of preservation and responsibility. Victorian households operated without modern refrigeration for much of the period. Meat, dairy, bread, preserves, spices, tea, sugar, and prepared dishes required care. Locking valuable stores could protect them. Recording use could prevent shortage. The same practical system could create a bodily consequence. A worker could be surrounded by food and remain unable to decide what counted as her meal. She might carry meat into storage, measure sugar, trim a joint, or clear an untouched sweet. Her labor gave physical access. The household rule denied personal entitlement. This distinction is the cleanest answer to the leftovers question. Cooking is an action. Ownership is a rule. In the Victorian domestic system, the first did not automatically create the second. The people whose hands transformed the food did not necessarily control its destination. The cook complicates the chain. In some houses, she was trusted to decide the servant's dinner. In others, she submitted a slate. She might keep tea or sugar within set limits. She might control the kitchen larder while the housekeeper controlled broader stores. Authority could be divided by department, and practice varied with household size. Variation did not remove accountability. It relocated it. If the mistress kept the keys, control was direct. If the housekeeper held them, control was delegated. If the cook received discretion, she became responsible for the result. If servants took board wages, the employer shifted some purchasing responsibility to them while preserving control of workplace and time. The key motif also reveals why upper servants received different treatment. Senior status came with trust over valuable property. The butler controlled wine and plate. The housekeeper controlled stores and female staff. The cook controlled skilled production. Their better room or course reflected not only personal favor, but their position inside the household's security system. Junior workers faced the other side of that trust. Their duties brought them near valued goods, while their rank invited supervision. A scullery maid washed cookware that held expensive food. A kitchen maid prepared ingredients from controlled stores. A footman carried wine he did not own. Domestic service demanded intimate access and limited personal claim at the same time. The contradiction helps explain the moral language of service. Employers praised honesty, steadiness, and economy because the home depended on workers handling private property out of direct family sight. Servants could also judge an employer by provision, regular meals, and fair allowances. Trust moved in both directions, even when power did not. At this point, the larder door is no longer just a boundary between food and hunger. It is a boundary between forms of authority. The mistress owns. The housekeeper accounts. The cook transforms. Junior staff carry and clean. Each action touches the same provision, but creates a different recognized claim. The next objects are smaller than the key, but they make this distribution measurable. Tea, sugar, beer, and washing could be issued in kind or converted into money. Their quantities show the household pricing daily life into the employment bargain. Tea, sugar, beer, and washing cross the wage boundary because a Victorian servant's cash salary was only one part of employment. A household could provide these things directly, issue fixed quantities, regulate common use, or add money intended to replace them. The choice affected both value and control. Tea and sugar are especially revealing. The guide describes households where each servant received an allowance at intervals. In other houses, staff did not receive a private issue. The housekeeper or cook regulated how much was used. Both arrangements provide tea. They do not provide the same autonomy. A personal allowance lets the worker decide when to use a limited quantity, perhaps save some, perhaps share it. Common regulated use gives the senior servant authority over timing and amount. Cash, instead of the article, gives market choice, but transfers the risk that prices or preferences will exceed the sum. The quantities were also ranked. The wage schedule distinguishes upper and under servants in several forms of compensation. Beer allowances differed by gender in the meal chapter. Men were assigned larger daily amounts than women. Some workers preferred money. Some women declined beer altogether. The manual discusses their choices through Victorian assumptions about health, sobriety, and proper behavior. We do not need to accept those assumptions to see the mechanism. The household assigned value differently to different bodies. A manservant and a womanservant could perform hard physical work and still receive unequal provision by rule. A junior woman could receive less cash allowance than a senior one. Rank and gender entered the meal before anyone sat down. Beer money shows the employer balancing economy and control. The guide says some households preferred cash because they believed it reduced waste and discouraged outsiders from lingering for drink. It also warns that cash could be spent in ways the employer disliked. Provision kept the substance inside household oversight. Money gave the worker more choice. The same tension appears in washing allowances. A household might provide washing or add money to wages. Clothing had to remain presentable because service demanded appearance. If the worker received cash, she gained responsibility for arranging the task. An allowance that sounds minor could shape hours, expense, and respectability. These fragments change how annual wages should be read. A cook receiving a higher salary than a scullery maid also occupied a different world of skill, authority, and likely provision. Two jobs with similar cash might differ through lodging, livery, meals, allowances, or opportunities. Food hierarchy was part of labor hierarchy. The guide's wage ranges make the latter concrete. A housekeeper might receive 30 to 50 pounds a year. A highly trained cook might receive 50 to 70, while a plain cook might receive 16 to 30. A head kitchen maid might receive 20 to 28. A second kitchen maid might receive 14 to 22. A scullery maid might receive 12 to 18, and a still room maid 10 to 14. These are recommendations from one period guide. Not a national wage census, but the spacing matters. Responsibility, skill, and trust produced visible cash differences before meals and allowances were added. The board wage schedule repeats the distinction. Upper women servants could receive more each week than under servants. Butlers and footmen were placed on another scale. When the household converted food into money, it preserved the same rank order it used at table. Compensation did not become equal merely because it became countable. It also changes the moral story around generosity. An employer who points to free meals may be describing compensation the worker expected as part of service. A servant who negotiates beer money is not asking for a gift. She is negotiating the form of an employment benefit. The household language of care can obscure an economic exchange. Board wages made that exchange most obvious, but every allowance carries the same logic. Convert tea to cash, and the hidden price appears. Convert beer to money, and a daily provision becomes a weekly sum. Remove full board, and the worker must buy food from wages. What seemed private and paternal becomes countable. The count could empower and expose. A worker can compare an allowance, save it, or seek a better place. She can also discover that the amount does not cover the promised need. The employer can claim economy while shifting risk. The form of payment changes who absorbs uncertainty. This is where servants possess agency without holding equal power. They could prefer cash, dislike a cold dinner, value a place that fed staff well, leave for a better situation, or build skill toward a higher post. The period debate over the servant problem existed partly because workers did make choices. Domestic service was personal, but it was still labor. Our story remains in Britain, and conditions differed by region, decade, house, and labor market. We will not turn one guide's schedule into every contract. The guide is valuable because it lays out the pieces respectable households recognized. Wages, meals, rooms, allowances, time, and character were negotiated as one package. The plate now carries an invisible price tag. The pudding marks rank. The leftover marks ownership. Tea and sugar mark regulated consumption. Board wages mark partial independence. The larder key marks delegated power. One object remains before we move to the final evidence. It is not a food object. It is the bell that could reach a servant during the meal the rule book had carefully scheduled. A bell could interrupt the very meal rules protected because domestic service joined workplace and home. The family could need a servant while the servant was eating. A visitor could arrive. A fire might need attention. A child might call. A dish upstairs might require clearing. The sound converted somebody else's need into immediate movement. The period guide gives breakfast, tea, and supper half an hour, and dinner an hour. It says bells were rung for the main meals, so staff knew when to gather. It also praises considerate masters and mistresses who tried not to ring for service during those allotted times. That advice is a small admission with a large consequence. If non-interruption had been automatic, consideration would not need to be named. The meal hour was vulnerable. A worker could be technically provided with dinner and still lose the uninterrupted time required to eat it. Food quantity and meal security are related, but not identical. Return to the still room maid. She carries dessert to the housekeeper's room, serves the upper staff, returns to her own dinner, and may be called again when cheese is wanted. Her work is built inside the meal sequence. The guide does not present this as abuse. It presents it as order. That is precisely why the scene reveals so much. Order distributes interruption unequally. The housekeeper sits at the senior table and rings. The still room maid moves. The butler carves. A footman carries. The cook may preside in the kitchen. Each role has action, but not each role has the same claim to stillness. The bell also collapses architectural distance. Service corridors and back stairs keep labor out of sight, yet a wire and spring allow the family room to reach below instantly. The worker may be physically separated from the dining room and still remain available to it. Privacy flows upward more easily than downward. This is one reason a servants' hall mattered. It offered a recognized place where staff could gather, eat, and sometimes spend limited leisure. But recognition did not make it sovereign. Senior servants could supervise conduct. Household rules governed seating and conversation. The bell connected the room back to duty. In a small household, the separation could be even thinner. The servant eats in the kitchen where work surrounds her. The mistress is near. A single maid may have no colleague to answer in her place. The same half hour, written in a manual, can carry different practical security depending on staff size. Meal interruption gives us a way to discuss harsh conditions without inventing an empty bowl. A worker may receive meat and vegetables and still experience a demanding food regime if the meal is rushed, delayed, watched, or interrupted. Another worker may receive plain bread and cheese at a regular protected hour and judge the place differently. Nutrition, time, dignity, and control intersect. Punctuality also depended on labor beginning early enough. The guide links orderly servant meals to early rising and observes that smaller households often had more work per person. That means the same breakfast hour could rest on very different mornings. In a great house, several workers divide fires, rooms, water, and food preparation. In a small home, one woman may complete several of those tasks before she sits. A clock can standardize the meal without standardizing the effort required to reach it. The bell also brings agency into focus. A servant could answer, delay, complain, negotiate through a senior worker, seek another place, or leave when conditions became intolerable. The evidence for any one response must be specific. What we can say at the system level is that employers worried about retaining good servants and that conditions formed part of a worker's choice. This prevents us from making servants either powerless shadows or modern employees with equal bargaining strength. Living in the employer's home created dependence. References mattered. Wages could be low. Gender and class narrowed options. Yet domestic workers moved between posts, developed skills, formed judgments about houses, and sometimes turned junior roles into careers. The bell, therefore, has two meanings. It demonstrates the employer's reach. It also reminds us that reach had to be maintained through a labor relationship. A house that rang constantly, fed poorly, or denied reasonable time could lose workers. A household manual urging consideration was responding to the practical need for cooperation as well as morality. By the final act, the bell will return once more. It will no longer be only a call from above. It will become evidence that a meal is a condition of work, not merely food placed on a table. Before then, we must look at the rooms as surviving traces. At Tatton Park, institutional interpretation names a plain servants' hall for lower staff and a steward's room with a diet closer to the employer's for upper servants. The house itself preserves the second dinner table our opening revealed. The plate tells less than the permission behind it, because identical food can represent different relationships. Cold meat served as an expected meal is one thing. The same meat granted as a favor is another. The same meat purchased from pooled board wages is another still. Ingredient lists cannot show those differences without rules, rooms, and decisions. Tatton Park gives the hierarchy a named setting. Its Victorian interpretation describes upper servants in modest apartments who ate in the steward's room, with a diet based on that of their employers. Lower servants ate plain food in the servants' hall. The house steward, housekeeper, butler, cook, valet, and lady's maid occupied senior positions. Workers doing much of the heaviest cleaning, kitchen, laundry, nursery, and service labor stood below them. That account does not prove every meal at Tatton or every year of practice. It shows how a museum reads the documented house system. Placed beside Beaton and the later Servant's Guide, it confirms that internal servant rank was not a decorative invention. Rooms and diets could follow it in a real country house. The word plain deserves care. Plain food can be sufficient or insufficient, well-cooked or poor, regular or irregular. It can be valued after hard work or resented beside visible luxury. The institutional description identifies contrast, not a complete nutritional judgment. We should not turn plain into starved without more evidence. The steward's room diet, being based on the employer's, is equally revealing. Senior servants did not simply eat more of the lower servant's meal. Their table could imitate the family in reduced form. The household reproduced its social order below stairs, giving trusted staff a controlled closeness to elite consumption. This imitation served management. Senior servants needed authority over junior staff. Separate rooms, better courses, and recognized precedents helped maintain it. The family did not have to supervise every breakfast or dinner directly. The hierarchy supervised itself. Food thus became a tool of delegated governance. A senior servant's privilege rewarded position and made rank visible. A junior servant saw a possible ladder, but also a current boundary. The cook at Audley End demonstrates that movement up the ladder was possible. Annie Chase's later career as a cook shows that a low kitchen role did not fix one identity forever. The physical rooms made these relationships durable. A steward's room, housekeeper's room, servant's hall, and kitchen each assigned a place. A doorway controlled movement without needing a written instruction every time. The worker learned where to sit, who entered first, who carved, and when to leave. This is the second dinner table, promised by the thumbnail territory. It is not simply another table for servants. It is evidence of hierarchy within service. The family banquet created one line. The senior servant table created another. The kitchen table in a small home created a different model again. Now look back at the leftover. In a house with several servant rooms, sending dining room suites below does not answer who received them. The destination matters. A dish sent to the housekeeper's room can be both a servant leftover and an upper servant privilege. A junior worker may have prepared, carried, and cleared it without sharing it. The plate alone cannot reveal that path once it is empty. The rule book can, the room can, the job title can, the ledger can. Historical truth emerges from joining those traces while keeping their limits visible. That method also protects workers from an easy moral arrangement in which every senior servant becomes cruel and every junior servant becomes only a victim. The housekeeper's authority was real, but so was her accountability upward. The cook's privilege was real, but so was the pressure of producing the feast. Junior workers faced constraint, but they could learn, judge, move, and build careers. The food hierarchy is therefore not a collection of villains. It is a system that distributes control unevenly. Individuals could enforce it harshly, soften it, navigate it, or seek another position. The evidence must tell us which before we assign a character. We are ready for the final question. Victorian Britain was changing how food reached markets and households. Railways moved provisions. Trade widened choices. Great kitchens handled increasing variety. Did that growing abundance weaken the old servant hierarchy, or did the household simply organize more food through the same rules? The answer begins with the difference between supply and entitlement. A modernizing market can fill the larder without changing who holds the key. Victorian Britain changed its food supply faster than domestic service changed its hierarchy. Railways carried food toward growing markets. Wider trade and commercial networks expanded what could reach urban and country households. Cookery books offered exact quantities, timed methods, and an increasingly confident language of household management. The larder could become more varied, while the key remained in the same hand. This is an important correction to the idea that old food systems were simply sparse. The Victorian period contained severe poverty and profound inequality, but it also contained expanding markets, new products, better transport, and elite households capable of extraordinary consumption. Abundance and deprivation grew close together. The country house kitchen sat at that intersection. Estate produce, purchased meat, imported goods, preserved foods, fuel, equipment, and skilled labor could converge in one service department. A cook like Avis Crocombe worked with knowledge shaped by both tradition and change. The family table displayed the result as taste and hospitality. Below stairs, market change entered through household authority. A new ingredient did not arrive as equal access. The mistress, housekeeper, cook, and senior staff still controlled purchasing, storage, menus, and distribution. Railways could move food across Britain more easily than a junior servant could move a dessert across a ranked doorway. That contrast does not mean servants gained nothing from wider supply. More reliable transport and greater variety could improve household provision. Cheaper or more available foods could change everyday meals. Skilled cooks could use a broader range of ingredients, but the benefit passed through the employment relationship. The same is true of technology. A more capable range, improved water supply, or better kitchen arrangement could reduce some tasks or increase production. Elite households often used efficiency to demand more elaborate service, more courses, or larger events. Labor saving for the family did not always mean less labor for the staff. The servants' ball cake at Audley End captures both sides. 50 eggs represent scale, planning, and access to provisions. The likely servant's occasion represents a collective benefit and social recognition. It also remains an exceptional event produced through the same kitchen hierarchy. Celebration does not cancel ordinary rank. The wider working-class context prevents the great house from becoming the whole Victorian story. English heritage notes that most domestic servants did not work in country houses, and that many did not receive full board. A maid in a modest urban home could face a very different food bargain from a cook in a wealthy estate. Some workers lived in, others did not. Household resources varied enormously. This variation is why the parent demand topic, Victorian servants, can support a specific episode without one universal verdict. The great house supplies visible contrast. The small household supplies direct oversight and combined labor. Board wages supply a cash alternative. Named estates, supply rooms, and people. Together they show a system flexible enough to change form while preserving unequal control. The flexibility may have helped domestic service survive. Employers could combine roles, reduce staff, substitute allowances, or move duties between cook and housekeeper. Workers could seek higher posts, prefer places with better provision, accept board wages, or leave the occupation. Food rules adjusted with the labor market. Our own channel has already examined an American servant problem in which workers used mobility to resist employer expectations. The British evidence here asks a different question. It does not center a shortage of maids in Gilded Age America. It centers the meal as a mechanism of rank inside Victorian Britain. Yet the stories touch at one point. A household could write rules, but it still depended on people choosing to remain. A cook's expertise increased that dependence. Losing a skilled cook threatened more than one dinner. It threatened the family's social performance and the staff meals organized through her department. A competent housekeeper carried institutional memory about stores, suppliers, workers, and expectations. Senior servants possessed knowledge the household needed. That dependence gave some workers leverage, but leverage was distributed unevenly. A young scullery maid was easier to replace than an established cook. A general servant in a small home might have broad practical skill, but weak formal status. References and reputation mattered. Age, gender, and available employment narrowed choices. Food provision could attract or repel. A place known for regular substantial meals offered real value. A place that interrupted dinner, reduced allowances, or pushed too much work onto too few hands could lose staff. The manual's advice to employers belongs inside this labor problem. Consideration was not only sentiment, it helped keep the household operating. The modernizing food supply therefore intensifies our answer. The issue was not simply whether enough food existed in Britain or even in one mansion. It was how the household converted supply into entitlement. More food could increase the feast, enlarge the leftovers, and expand the cook's work without changing the junior worker's authority over any of it. One final comparison will test that claim. At Audley End, the supply books name abundance. The institution preserving them refuses to name exact servant consumption. That honest gap lets us separate what entered the house from what reached a person. At Audley End, the supply books name abundance without naming the diners who received each share. Mutton, beef, veal, turkey, rabbit, and game appear in the household record described by English Heritage. The list is rich enough to invite a vivid menu. The institution stops short. It says exact servant consumption is not known. That boundary is not a failure of research. It is evidence about record-making. Households recorded purchases because purchases affected accounts. Cooks recorded recipes because recipes preserved professional knowledge. Employers and senior servants recorded wages, duties, or staff because management required them. A junior worker's ordinary plate often created no reason for a durable document. The archive, therefore, reflects household priorities. Money leaves a ledger. A grand dinner leaves a menu. A prized recipe leaves a notebook. A special event leaves a large cake. Routine eating can disappear, especially when the eater held little documentary power. Different source types must therefore answer different questions. The manual is strongest on prescribed order. The named house is strongest on place, staff, and surviving objects. The supply book is strongest on acquisition. The recipe notebook is strongest on craft. A later museum interpretation can connect those traces, but should state its degree of confidence. No single source carries the entire meal from market to mouth. Corroboration works by overlap. When Beaton and the later guide both describe separate rooms for senior servants, Tatton's preserved hierarchy gains context. When Audley End's staff record places real workers in a large kitchen, The manual's duty structure gains embodiment. When the institution says exact consumption is unknown, it prevents the overlap from becoming a false personal menu. This creates a risk for storytellers. The silent space invites completion. A composite maid is given a name. A plausible bowl is placed in her hands. Her thoughts are supplied. One exact day becomes representative of a class. The story feels humane because it makes an unseen person visible, but it can replace that person with an invention. Our approach is different. We use bounded groups when the record gives only roles. We use real names when the institution supports them. We describe actions assigned by manuals without pretending they occurred identically in every house. We say likely when the source says likely. We say unknown where a supply list ends. This method still allows mental cinema because material action survives. The still room maid carries pudding, lays the table, hands plates, and returns. The housekeeper unlocks stores, issues quantities, and accounts for use. The cook writes a dinner slate or caters for pooled board wages. Kitchen workers prepare, carry, wash, and move through documented rooms. None of those actions needs an invented confession. The Audley staff record also gives later consequences. Mary Ann Bulmer did not remain fixed forever as first kitchen maid. She married. Sylvia Wise's life was shorter. Annie Chase moved from a junior kitchen role into a long career as a cook and left property when she died. Their outcomes differ enough to break the idea of one servant destiny. We should resist using those outcomes as rewards or punishments written by the job. Marriage did not prove escape. A cook's career did not erase early hardship. An early death does not prove a kitchen caused it. The evidence gives a sequence, not a simple moral equation. What the sequence does prove is agency through time. A worker could move roles, leave service, marry, build skill, save, or face losses the household record barely explains. A title in one census is a position, not a whole person. The food system shaped those paths. Kitchen work could teach valuable skill. Seniority could improve wages and status. A reliable place could provide board and lodging. An exhausting place could narrow health and choice. We need individual evidence before assigning a cause, but the employment structure defined the conditions in which choices were made. The supply books also remind us that abundance had labor attached. Every listed animal or provision had to be received, stored, prepared, cooked, served, cleared, and reused or discarded. Variety increased knowledge demands. A feast expanded the chain of tasks. The record of plenty is also a record of work, even when the labor names appear elsewhere. Now compare that chain with the dining room remainder. The family sees a dish that may return at luncheon. The housekeeper sees value to account for. The cook sees an ingredient or prepared item with possible uses. A junior worker sees another object to carry and clean. The same food occupies several economic and bodily worlds. If we ask only what servants ate, we may produce a list. If we ask who decided, we expose the institution. Rank decides the room. The mistress, or delegated officer, decides the provision. The cook decides within the space she is given. The worker's bargaining position decides how much she can influence the arrangement. This is why exact quantities can mislead without relationships. A stated tea allowance sounds precise. but its meaning depends on wages, prices, common use, and whether cash replaces it. A hot dinner sounds generous, but its meaning depends on timing and interruption. Bread and cheese sound harsh, but their meaning depends on quantity, regularity, labor, and alternatives. The story has moved beyond a choice between feast and starvation. It now contains a range of documented conditions. Some servants received substantial meals. Some received plainer and more restricted food. Senior staff could receive family dishes. Junior staff could be excluded. Some workers gained limited control through board wages. Many individual plates remain unknown. That range is not a weak ending. It is the answer the sources support. The final evidence is the empty space itself, but we must turn it into a human consequence rather than an abstract warning. The final evidence begins with an honest, empty space between provision and consumption. On one side, the sources are unusually detailed. They name meal hours, rooms, ranks, allowances, wages, dishes, and duties. On the other, they often cannot tell us whether one young woman finished one plate before a bell rang. That gap changes the governing question for the last time. At the beginning, we asked who got the leftovers. A simple answer would name a group. The documented answer names a process. The family retained the first claim. The mistress set or delegated policy. The housekeeper protected and accounted for stores. The cook exercised skill and sometimes discretion. Rank directed courses and rooms. Household scale changed the chain. Board wages shifted part of the decision toward servants. Exact outcomes varied. This process explains why opposite anecdotes can both sound plausible. One servant remembers substantial meals. Another describes monotony or restriction. One house sends dining room suites to senior staff. Another saves them for family luncheon. One cook plans the servants' dinner. Another submits it for approval. One staff receives full board. Another pools wages. The system permitted variation because authority remained local to the household. The variation also explains why a single sensational case cannot carry the whole class. A documented case of underfeeding would prove that case and perhaps a wider risk. It would not erase the manuals prescribing substantial meals or the institutions recording richer provision. A generous celebration would prove that event, not daily equality. The strongest information advantage is therefore epistemic and human at once. We know more than the viral titles usually admit about rules. We know less than they claim about private plates. Holding both truths gives workers more dignity, not less. They become people acting inside specific conditions rather than props assigned to a universal misery. Avis Crocombe's notebook is transformed by this conclusion. At first, it looked like a window onto Victorian eating. Now it is also a boundary marker. It reveals the cook's hand, memory, and expertise. It does not let us see through every doorway. Its silence about a scullery-maid supper is not permission to invent one. The still room maid is transformed too. She remains unnamed, but she is not empty. Her role, route, task, and position are documented. She carries dessert to senior servants. She serves them. She returns to her meal. We do not know whether she resented the hierarchy, accepted it, hoped to rise within it, or judged that particular household fair. The one honest residue is her private experience. That residue is not needed to prove the title. The title is proved by the rule. Victorian servants prepared elite food. dining room remains could go to upper servants, remain with the family, or be excluded from the kitchen according to household policy. The person doing the work did not possess an automatic claim. The human consequence reaches farther than one leftover. Food control shaped time, status, cash, and opportunity. A junior worker could lose part of her meal hour to service. A senior worker could gain a better room and course. A cook could turn discretion into better staff food or use board wages to cater for a group. A housekeeper could gain authority and responsibility through the key. Those consequences also carried future meaning. Kitchen experience could lead from scullery work to a cook's career. Seniority could raise wages. A poor place could encourage departure. A good provision system could help retain staff. Food was part of the labor market even when employers described it as household care. The second dinner table is now fully visible. It is not merely furniture. It is a management technology. It rewards trusted staff, separates ranks, and reduces the need for direct family supervision. The servants' hall does the same for junior staff. The kitchen table compresses the system in smaller homes. Each table organizes people as well as meals. The larder key is also transformed. It began as a sign of restriction. It ends as a sign of delegated power. The housekeeper holding it is both worker and manager. She protects family property and controls staff access. Her authority cannot be understood through victim or villain alone. The bell completes the chain. It turns family demand into servant movement. The manual's attempt to protect mealtime proves that eating was a work condition. A dinner can be adequate on paper and insecure in practice if the worker cannot finish it. Time belongs inside the leftovers story, because the ability to eat depends on more than food. Now imagine the entire route of one pudding, without inventing an individual household event. Ingredients enter the stores. The housekeeper accounts for them. The cook and kitchen staff prepare the dish. It moves to the family dining room or a staff dinner according to plan. If it remains, a rule assigns its future. A still room maid may carry it to the housekeeper's room. Senior servants receive it. The maid returns to another table. Later, a bell may call. Every stage is ordinary. Together, they reveal a class machine. The mansion does not merely display wealth. It converts wealth into controlled access through rooms, titles, keys, ledgers, slates, allowances, and time. Food makes the mechanism tangible because it must pass through bodies as well as accounts. This is what the strongest breakout competitors sense when they place a servant beside a feast. The contrast is real. Their weakness is stopping at the image, or filling the gap with unsupported names and universal claims. Our answer goes deeper. The plate is not just smaller, it is governed. The final scene returns to 1 o'clock. Hot meat and vegetables are on the table. The upper servants are about to leave for pudding. The still room maid stands between the two rooms. This time, we can see the whole system moving with her. Return now to the still room maid carrying pudding across the threshold. She is not crossing from the family dining room into one united servants' world. She is crossing between ranks within service. The people waiting in the housekeeper's room are servants, but the household recognizes their superior place. She sets down the dish, hands the plates, and returns to finish her own dinner. That movement is the title's answer in human form. Victorian servants cooked the feast. But leftovers and favored courses followed ownership, permission, and rank. Some reached senior servants, some joined a general staff meal, some stayed reserved for the family. No single route governed every house. The rule changed with scale. A mansion could maintain a steward's room, a housekeeper's room, a servant's hall, and a kitchen table. A smaller home might have only the kitchen. The rule changed with compensation. Full board kept provision under household control. Board wages gave servants limited collective purchasing power. The rule changed with delegated authority. A trusted cook might decide. A strict mistress might alter the slate. A housekeeper might measure the allowance and lock the store. The food itself did not carry a social class. The household assigned one. Pudding became an upper servant course. Bread and cheese became an economical supper. Tea became an allowance. Beer became cash. A leftover became tomorrow's family luncheon. The same edible substance changed meaning through a decision. The named workers at Audley End keep that mechanism from becoming abstract. Avis Crocombe left professional knowledge. Mary Ann Bulmer, Sylvia Wise, and Annie Chase occupied different points in the kitchen chain and followed different lives. Their records give us skill, age, work, movement, and consequence. They do not give us permission to invent every thought or meal. That is the final honest boundary. We cannot reconstruct each servant's plate. We can reconstruct the system that made the plate conditional. Manuals, rooms, notebooks, staff records, supply books, wage schedules, and allowances agree on the central point. Food below stairs was organized labor, compensation, hierarchy, and property at once. The bell rings one last time in our story. At first it threatened to cut a meal short. Now it reveals the bargain beneath the house. A servant received food and lodging, partly because the household expected availability. Considerate employers protected mealtime because cooperation had practical value. Workers judged places, learned skills, moved posts, and sometimes gained authority of their own. The mansion's grandeur depended on that cooperation. A recipe without hands fed no one. A larder without management spoiled. A dining room without carrying, clearing, and washing could not sustain display. The people below stairs did more than consume whatever remained. They created the conditions that made abundance visible. Yet creation did not equal ownership. That is the implication beyond the click. The feast and the leftover belong to the same economy, but not to the same claim. The worker could make value, handle value, preserve value, and still require permission to eat it. The pudding dish disappears from the surviving record after the rulebook scene. We do not know the maid's name or whether her dinner was warm when she returned. We do know why she had to return. The second table was waiting, and rank had already decided who would stay there. That narrow unknown is worth preserving. It leaves space for the real range of servant experience instead of forcing every worker into one dramatic bowl. A future diary, account, or house archive may clarify one life. It would deepen the system we have traced, not justify rewriting every other plate. Honest history can carry feeling without pretending to hear a voice the record did not save. That is the answer. Not one menu, not one universal misery, a controlled food system whose rules change the room, the course, the worker's time, and the future of every leftover.